today, and then Wednesday will be review, exam on Friday. Okay. All right. Logan, did you shut that door? All right. So I think this is what we have got to anticipation. So we're looking at manipulation skills, and in particular catching, but skills where we have to intercept an object. All right. And so we had mentioned the fact that helpful.
We put our essay in on Monday.
We had started looking at the fact that, you know, we've got to move to where we want to be. We need to be able to time closing our hand. We've got to know what shape our hand has to be to catch the object or pick the object up. All right. So part of what the brain has to learn in order to intercept an object is to anticipate maybe where the object is going to be. All right. And what we see with children who are developing anticipation is that they often are able to manipulate things very well before they're able to anticipate being in the right place. And it's not just children, it's really people who are inexperienced at a skill. If you watch an adult play tennis who has not a lot of experience at playing tennis, they wait a long time before they move towards the ball, right? Because they're not able to judge where that ball is going to be. Okay? So it isn't just children, it's just the research is looking at the children. When we look at the studies that are trying to get at the bottom of anticipation, they use what we call coincidence anticipation tasks. You just want to be a little bit wary when you're looking at this information, because a lot of this work, this research is lab-based. Right? They do star tracing, or a light comes on, and depending which light comes on, they have to hit a particular object, and things like that. So we don't have a lot of real-world studies to help us out in this area. But what we're interested in finding out is how well can we anticipate the movement and coincide with where the object is going to be. Right? And some of the influential factors on this, when we look at the development, we see improvement with age depending on how we manipulate the constraints and the factors. Right? So oftentimes the size of the ball makes a difference. Right? A large ball that moves slowly is a good way to start teaching someone how to catch. The problem with a large ball that moves slowly is that it doesn't encourage catching with our hands. It tends to encourage catching with our arms. So using a large ball produces lower levels of catching score quite often, but it allows the individual to learn about trajectories, about moving to the right place, and other things. So you have to trade off a little bit. If I'm going to use a small ball and encourage them to go with their hands, then I probably am going to have to throw the ball very directly at them and not get them to try to judge by throwing to one side or the other or over their head. Right? So when we're teaching throwing, we have to take into account the size of the ball, the speed of the ball, the distance that the person might have to move to intercept. So the further the distance, the less accurate people without experience become. The color and the background can make a difference. So a blue ball against a white background seems to make it easier to catch, according to the research. It's a very strong, distinct difference between the color of the ball and the background, and so that probably gives the brain plenty of visual cues to identify the ball and where it is. Right? So what could you do in your gym? What if your gym doesn't have white walls?
I know I used to play in the gym where the light would be yellow, so that would tell you are.
Yeah, that would. Right? So, can I paint the wall in the gym? Am I allowed? Can I change the light bulbs? Can I, if I can't paint the wall, can I get big sheets of white paper and tape up one wall on a day when we're going to do catching? Okay, things like that. So think about, if that's what the research says, that a blue ball against a white background results in more successful catching attempts, then how can I create that when I'm trying to teach catching? The other thing I've found is that the color of the ball makes a difference, because if it's their favorite color, they pay more attention to trying to catch it than if it's a color they don't like. So it's important when you're buying in your equipment to make sure that you've got a whole range of different colors if you're going to be working with kindergarten or elementary children. Once you're working with middle school and high school or adults, then obviously the color of the ball doesn't matter. All right, but think about the population that you're working with. Speed of the ball is important. So if I can slow it down, how much is that going to help? So what you want to try to do is to keep the speed as consistent as you possibly can from trial to trial. Okay? So keep the speed consistent, because when we change it up, just like in baseball or cricket or anything else, right? Sometimes we get caught out because the pitcher changes up the speed of the ball and you were expecting something else. Okay? Well, it's a very similar concept when we look at catching. If one time I throw the ball very fast and the next time I throw the ball slow, for someone who is inexperienced with catching, that makes it very difficult for them to judge where the ball is going to be in the air. Right? So we want, from trial to trial, when we're working with beginners, make sure that we're as consistent as possible. All right, so last week I was saying that the brain has to run some calculations to judge where to put your hands in relation to the trajectory of the ball. And that is a very information processing based point of view, because that was my original background and I'm kind of stuck there. Because that makes sense to me, because that's what I learned when I was younger. But we have a different approach now that we can use. It's not that information processing is wrong, but many people are now using an ecological perspective. And our book, remember way back at the beginning of the semester, we said our book is based primarily in the ecological perspective. And so what they talk about is, instead of a calculation per se, that we have perception action occurring. But it's not necessary to calculate, because there are fixed environmental constraints that are occurring that dictate where the ball is going to be. So instead of having to calculate, I can recognize the environmental constraints and I know where to go. So I can perceive certain pieces of information, and I can act on that without having to calculate something. Right? So the perception of the possibility in the environment for moving is called an affordance, and we'll come back to that concept in a later chapter. Okay. So we've got two main characteristics of this interaction between the person and the environment, all right, this system that we have. The first are stable patterns, consistent patterns that occur that are invariant. So invariant means they don't change. Okay. The other is an expanding optical array. So the retina in the back of my eye receives visual information. And if I am moving towards something, the picture on the back of my retina gets bigger. If I'm moving away from something, the picture gets smaller. Right? That's not going to change. Okay? That will always happen. So if you're sitting in your car and the car in front of you is getting bigger, what does that mean?
It is closer.
Right? So you probably don't want to hit the accelerator, right? So that's an important idea. Okay? The car can't be getting bigger. Okay? As adults, we know the car isn't growing, right? And yet the car is getting bigger on the retina. So that means either the car is slowing down and I need to respond to that, or I'm speeding up and I need to respond to that because the car in front of me is not speeding up. So the brain can use that information and create an action without having to calculate, because that information never changes. Right? Let's see. The rate of change, so how quickly this picture on your retina is expanding or contracting, may be the key that the brain uses to provide information for the arrival of the ball. So if I'm standing still and the ball is getting bigger, perhaps how quickly the ball is getting bigger is the clue that I can use to move my hands, rather than having to calculate something. It's just a different approach, different way of thinking about it. Come back here. So figure 9.9 gives another invariant occurrence that occurs. So when I move sideways, if the angle stays the same, if I move at a time where the angle stays the same between my path of movement and the trajectory of the ball, I can anticipate where the ball is going to land.
It's just, your mind just makes the calculation. That's all.
Yeah, and see, my terms of calculations are based in an information processing. What an ecological person would say is it doesn't have to calculate, because as long as that angle stays the same, you know where that ball is going to be. And no theory answers everything. I like the calculator. I have to say, this is one time where I really like the information processing approach, but I do think it's because that's when the training was.
Just how your brain proceeds.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
Don't worry about the math unless you want to. There's quite a lot of math involved in these two concepts. Don't worry about the math. There's research that suggests that we intercept a moving ball by keeping the ratio of the flight of the ball and my gaze constant, right? So that was one piece of research that tried to take this perception action, say as long as I'm in the same kind of angle with the ball, If I have to look up or I have to look down, that changes whether I've got to move forwards or move backwards. Right? The vertical optical acceleration, I don't know. I haven't read the paper. The concept is that you have to keep the acceleration of the ball in the vertical plane at a certain
I was just
ratio.
about to ask you, because in baseball they have something called knuckleball where it goes all over. So how do, visually that's hard to do, so.
I don't, this one is more than my brain can cope with. This one makes sense to me, right? If I have to drop my head down, that means I have to move forwards. If I'm having to lift up, that means I have to move
It's
backwards.
like catching a bunny.
But this vertical optical acceleration is a little,
Because there's also like,
I don't know enough
it's
about-
slow, but then it picks up speed.
yeah. I don't know enough about how the ball moves in the vertical plane because I don't play ball games. So, as long as the ratios and angles provide an invariant relationship, that's the key for this perspective, right? Is that by maintaining a constant ratio, that gives the brain information that it can use to put you in the right place without calculating something. So how do children, and again the book goes with children because we would hope that adults were good catchers, right? But really you've got to remember that children means inexperienced people because you are going to come across adults that are not any good at this, right? So the angle of the gaze when they stand still and catch the ball. So this goes back to the idea that it's okay to use maybe a slower ball, a bigger ball. It's not going to teach them how to use their hands to catch, but it will give their brain the chance to learn some of these concepts about where do I need to look? If the ball is going to land right there, what's my angle of gaze? It's not cognitive, right? It's the brain learning the skill. And then eventually we can move them around and hopefully that they'll be able to move at an appropriate time and get in the right place, in the way of the ball. Okay. Experience is the key. So can I get them confident that they can catch? And then can I get them to start to try to move? There's not a lot of research that I've seen that says you have to do it one way or the other. Maybe I start moving them first, but that does complicate things a lot. My preference would be, can I get them to feel like they can catch the ball? And then try to move them around. Okay. Those of you on the playground today might have seen one of the early childhood girls was playing catch with Noah number 2. Right? And he was missing the ball a lot, and maybe he stuck with it as long as he did, because she was tossing the ball up really high. Right? And they can't track an arc at this age very well. Right? So, is it good experience for his brain? Absolutely. As I say, for most children, having dropped the ball 3 or 4 times, they would not have stuck with playing catch. Right? They would have left and done something else. He's just got a real fetish with catching right now, so I suspect that either a sibling or his dad or mum are playing, that's what they're playing at home, because he's really, really keen on that at the moment. So even if he misses the ball, he doesn't seem to mind. He's willing to have another go. So that's very unusual. Right? So then when we're teaching catching, we've got to manipulate different constraints that are going to provide different amounts of information while we allow people to practice. Right? You could restrict the view. There's some research that says, well, if you make them work with one hand, but you make them catch behind the curtain, okay, the brain learns to pick up information from the initial part of the trajectory to where to put its hand. Can play around with all kinds of things. Can we turn the lights down in the gym and still catch? How hard is it? Okay. So, important sources of information also seem to help novice adults. And if you're working with adults who can't catch, you want to explain to them more what you're doing, because even though it's not a cognitive learning process all the time, adults respond better to information, right? They want to know why you're doing what you're doing. And if you can get them to anticipate sooner, then that helps them out a lot as we get older, right? Because we are going to slow down, period. If I live long enough, right, after the age of 50, 55, we start to slow down. So if I exercise, slowing down will be less, but you still slow down. So what we see when we look at older adults is that if they were experienced at catching when they were younger, okay, then their success at catching as they get older tends to be more reliant upon individual constraints that might restrict their movement ability. So they're slowing down, or they've got arthritis in their hip or in their elbow and they can't stretch as far as they used to be able to. Right? But if they were experienced, they're very good at moving towards the right place. It just depends whether or not they can get there quickly enough. And so what we find is the more experienced we are, the sooner they start going in the right direction, and that compensates a little bit for the fact that they're slowing down. Older adults in the lab tests tend to be a little more variable on these lab tests that we do, particularly if they're sedentary. So if we don't have that piece of research replicated in the real world, but if I'm a sedentary adult and I'm doing more poorly, more variable on a lab test, and I'm going to work with sedentary adults, then that means I need to expect that they're going to be highly variable. All right? So I need to allow for that. I need to make sure they understand that that's part of the learning curve at this age. Right? So maybe they don't catch 2 balls in a row, but when they catch one, it's really good. And we definitely see improvement, maybe even to the same extent that we would see with a younger adult if they get to practice enough. Right? So, as I say, just be a little bit careful when you're reading this chapter, because a lot of the research, particularly information that is earlier than the year 2000, is on a task that is in a lab. Generally sitting down at a table, hitting buttons, moving my hands, or shifting things from one place to another place. So you've got to take into account that that's not a real world. What's going to happen? I can take that research and understand it, but when I transfer it to a real world scenario, I may not see the same result. Right? And then we have skills like driving and piloting. Right? Driving, as adults in America, you have heaps and heaps and heaps of experience at driving. right? Legally, you start at 16. A lot of people, particularly in this area of the country, seem to start at 4, which is a little disturbing. But sometimes the kids will say that they were driving something on the branch. Right? So we have lots of driving experience. Driving is a manipulative skill. Even if you drive an automatic car, if you drive a manual, a stick shift, it's even more manipulative. Right? But when we look at the research on what happens to manipulation skills as we get older, then sometimes people question whether or not we should be having people in their 80s and 90s driving. It's a very emotional topic because people who are in their 80s and 90s want to be as independent as possible. And if you can't drive, again, in vast areas of this country, you don't have a public transport system. So if I can't drive, how do I maintain my independence? But driving is a very complex skill. Right? And the more complex it is, the more error we see as we get older. So it's a difficult question to think about. Right? They also have, so if we think about functional constraints first. So the functional constraints are the primary problem when we look at manipulation tasks in older adults, because they have harder time paying attention to a particular thing. Their attentional focus, it's much easier to distract someone who's older than it is someone your age. Right? So if there's more than one thing going on, that becomes much more difficult for them to attend to one task. Their coordination starts to deteriorate, possibly, particularly if they don't maintain their strength. Right? Planning and decision making slows down as we get older. Well, that's pretty crucial if I'm driving a car. Right? Making a decision. So the light is changing. Do I accelerate? Do I brake? Okay. Then we also have structural constraints. Their weight. What about their hands? Right? If I've got to manipulate a steering wheel really quickly because I hit some black ice, strength. Mobility in the hands.
With that, like rheumatoid arthritis would be a structural constraint, right? Not an environmental one. Because
Structural.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right? So just keep thinking, what about all the types of constraints? Is it as easy to drive in the dark as it is in the daylight? Right? Not as you get older, because your eyesight starts to deteriorate. Right? What about in the rain versus not in the rain?
Snow.
Or the snow, or the ice, right? So all of these constraints interact. Remember, we have an interaction. So if I've got weaker hands or less mobile hands, and I have environment or task constraints that are interacting with changing structural constraints, we see big changes in movement behavior. Right? Okay, so expertise then can help alleviate some of the problems. And as I said, most of you, one of the good things about having to drive when you're older in this country is that you're highly expert at driving. You've done a lot of it. Okay? So it can offset some of the aging effects that we see. Practice. You get a lot of practice, so again, that's a big benefit over here. It helps to maintain skill. So as I get older, maybe what we want to make sure is that we keep driving, that we don't take long periods of time off where we don't drive, because then when we come back, perhaps we can't compensate as well for some of these other individual constraints that are occurring. Right? So we want to keep doing for as long as possible. At some point though, probably we shouldn't be driving. And we don't really test for that. My landlady in Alabama is 96 and she still drives to South Carolina on her own for New Year's Eve.
She's 96.
Yeah.
Just,
It's a little scary. It's good. Yeah. So, right? Is that's really important to her quality of life? Really important to her. Is it safe? Not so sure. You know, and if you kill yourself, that's okay. Well, you took that chance, right? It's, if you take someone with you.
96 years, you know.
Yeah.
Kind of ones.
Piloting is also a manipulative skill, right? So we still do manipulative skills as we get older, even if they're not sport skills, right? So the data isn't only look outside the box. It's not just sport skills. That's what we're the most interested in, but it affects other things as well. Okay? Question?
Like, I just want to know, how does this like pertain to like older teenagers? I want to be a personal trainer, right? And we have to go and watch little kids, but how does that like relate for me in that aspect? Like what I want to do as a career. And I've been thinking about it, like, why do you have this little kids?
With the little kids?
I know it's your research and all that, but like,
No,
how does it?
because when we look, it's a good question. When we look at fundamental motor skills, all right? If you go back to some of the models that I gave you earlier, what we believe